There is a federal by-election coming up in British Columbia on December 16th. The Cloverdale Langley City riding was held by the Liberals until the Member of Parliament decided to step down and run in the recent provincial election. Small business owner Madison Fleischer is running for the Liberals, but a BC Métis society is distancing itself from the candidate who has claimed Métis identity. For more on this, our Truth in Politics panel is here. Jennifer Leywitz is the CEO of Pasqua Harbor Strategies, and Negon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Negon, thanks for being here as always. Jennifer, we'll start with you, and can you help us understand what's going on here with the Madison Fleischer, the Liberal candidate in next month's BC by-election?
Yeah, so basically from what I've been told is, there's been some information floating around from a Métis society out of British Columbia that allegedly there was a Liberal candidate that had reached out to them, and I'm kind of just signaling to their statement that she had asked for an endorsement at one point during her nomination or during the campaign, and they had come back and said, well, are you able to actually point to where your identity ties to, like a family name, anything like that? Because asking any Indigenous governing body or organization for an endorsement during a political campaign is a fairly big ask. And I don't think they were unreasonable in asking for that. And from what I understand, from what I've seen play out, is that those calls for that verification have not been met. And since then, she has removed the term Métis and Indigenous from all of her social media, and then has since turned into saying, well, now I'll apply for my Métis citizenship or my Métis card in the province of British Columbia. But one would think that that should have been done before even entering the space of asking for an endorsement.
She does have Indigenous advocates still there, but Negon, like Jen saying, BC Métis Society distancing itself from her after they met with her earlier this week, even saying she should step down. Your thoughts?
People, before they claim indigeneity, have to have someone who claims them. So there's a saying in our community, it's not about who you claim, but who claims you. And how you get claimed is through work, through the role that you have in community, through the chopping of the wood, the washing of dishes, the being a good relative. And so it's not about ancestry. And one of the challenges is that individuals who claim some distant grandmother in some community or grandfather or whatever it might be, certainly we see politicians all across the country claiming indigeneity because they see some kind of benefit in it. And that tells you that, there's a very significant change in attitude in particular corners of the political world that this favors you. And second is that you can just do so willingly and parties do not somehow vet you or do not check on you. So as we begin to see parties that begin to ask the proper questions because they are working with Indigenous peoples or communities, legitimate Indigenous organizations, you then have legitimate questions being asked. And in this case, it is not appropriate to simply just claim to be Indigenous unless you have some kind of grounding for that claim. And what that means is who claims you, who can stand up for you, who can represent you. And that's what Jen is talking about when talking about either a name or a family. And it's more than a genealogy. It's actually about the work that you do, not simply who did you come from.
Jennifer, just last week we were here discussing Randy Bosno, and here we go again. Why do you think people continue to try this?
I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we have structured opportunity. And that is a big word to use because it shouldn't be viewed as privilege or opportunity, but you will notice that a lot of people keep bringing that up over and over and over again when you call out people that are essentially pretending or copying an identity that doesn't actually belong to them. Because, historically over time, especially as we bring reconciliation to the forefront, there's been historical trauma for Indigenous people across the country. We had the pass system, we've had enfranchisement, we've had things that have hindered us from reaching our full potential over time. And now in comes the government with grants and opportunities to essentially try to level that playing field. But the problem is when you put the concept of identifying identity into the hands of government and people who have traditionally got it wrong in the past, what's going to happen? And I think that's what we're seeing here play out. And on top of that, I know people are going to be, a little bit nitpicky for me bringing this up, but again, identity politics. The hard truth is that no federal party in Canada has latched on to Indigenous identity more than the Liberal Party of Canada has. And I truly believe it's because this was their signal to reconciliation. But in hindsight, what has it done? We now had an Indigenous caucus that's been speaking on behalf of Indigenous people. And you go back and there's people within that caucus that aren't even Indigenous. So what does that do? And what does that do for the space of Indigenous people getting into politics? If there's a political party that is at the forefront of reconciliation and Indigenous identity, you need to get your house in order first and figure out how you're actually going to verify the Indigenous people within that camp before you're going to take a lead on that.
Nigan, this is a seat that the Liberals held prior to this upcoming by-election, but it's swung between the Liberals and the Conservatives in the past. Do you think all this could be costly at the ballot box for the Liberals?
I mean, it remains to be seen, I suppose. But Jen's right. The Liberals have put a lot of eggs in the basket of trying to gain political power, political credibility by appealing to not just Indigenous voters, but to, I think, a country that wants or is interested in or is in some level engaged with the issue of reconciliation. And BC is one of those places. I mean, BC, in which you see the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples being passed by a province, not simply just by a federal government. What you see in British Columbia kind of a sensibility or a relationship with indigeneity that looks very similar to the prairies, and in some corners of BC, much more so. And would this be impactful to the ways in which this particular by-election will look? It suggests that there could be some ramifications. But what I'm really interested in is what is the Liberal Party going to do about this? They have a scandal right in front of them with Randy Boissonnault. And the fact is that Randy Boissonnault claimed to be Indigenous, what looks like, because of a financial gain, because of a way in which maybe the connections with community are scant, are not evident, certainly not something that can be openly talked about or openly pointed to. And what this looks like is an individual that's much in the same vein. Will the Liberal Party take a stand in which they will demand more accountability for a person who is claiming Indigenous identity to have a relationship with Indigenous peoples? I mean, that same caucus that Jen was speaking about just a minute ago wasn't just about people who were claiming Indigenous identity and perhaps not had a legitimate means to do so, but it was actually the national chief, the now national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Cindy Woodhouse is a former member of that caucus, as well as many other people who were part of the Liberal caucus that had relationships with the Liberal Party that is very deep, very strong, and has directed the Liberal Party for quite a long time. And I think that the Liberal Party, when you have a number of people at the table who should know better, that you should listen to those individuals, but also that you should be acting better.
Jennifer, Fleischer says, as we mentioned, that she identifies as Métis and is in the process of putting together the application for Métis citizenship. Should that process not be allowed to play out here?
No, I think that process should absolutely play out. I think that if there is, any concern or question around your identity, we have to look at the fact that over time, historically, government has done everything that they possibly could to eliminate the Indian from the Indian. And obviously that is going to have ramifications, and we're going to see that play out in modern day. We've seen it through residential schools, 60 Scoop, the modern child welfare system. There are going to be very real things that have impacted not only your connection to your identity, but your connection to your community. And we have to leave space. I talk about this all the time. My own nation knows that this is something I prioritize, is inviting people back in and giving them space to come back to community. But there is a very, very big difference between attempting to travel that road back into community or back to who you think you are, whereas you're just putting it in your bio on social media and you're going through law school or you're running to run in politics. For me, that signals that you see benefit in doing that before actually doing the work to figure out who you are.
Nigan, the Liberal Party has not yet responded about any of this or whether it has a vetting process to verify potential candidates' claims to Indigenous ancestry. Is this not something that all parties really should be looking into or having?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And here's the good thing is that while political parties may be not interested or engaged or developing a process to be able to vet individuals who claim Indigenous identity, institutions across the country are, particularly universities, because universities have been caught perhaps the worst off. That kind of checking the box, as it were, as talked about, or people who have benefited tremendously from claiming Indigenous identity. Certainly, we have evidence, ample evidence, now dozens of examples across the country of people who are making six-figure income by claiming to be Indigenous and have done so since going back to the 1970s, 1980s with very dubious claims. There's a simple rule that I use, and it's something that was taught to me by my community, by my family, by my father. We would never reject our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren when they come home. If they wanted to get some food, or if they wanted to sit by the fire, or if they wanted to sit and listen to our community and spend time with us, you would never turn your great grandchildren away. You would never be like, oh, we don't have room for you. We would say, come in, sit, and most importantly, listen, and then eventually do some work. Start to help us and help build our community, help build the fire, help raise the water. And then soon enough, then you get to call yourself as a part of the community. You don't just simply get to call yourself a part of the community because 3, 4, 5 generations back, someone from your family sat by the fire. You have to earn your place in our community, and you just don't simply have a right to it. And that's one of the big problems in the country, which is the concept of Indigenous rights. What we think of it is Indigenous responsibilities. That's an Indigenous way of perceiving about identity. And identity is about responsibility. It's not really about saying, I have an entitlement.
Jennifer, Niigaan mentioned there universities, some are starting to do this. Other organizations are starting to do this. Should the people that are making the laws of the land not have some sort of vetting process in place for this?
I think there definitely has to be some type of better vetting process in place. I know the University of Saskatchewan has done a lot of work in this area over the last few years. They've actually changed their policy around how they accept identification in. And now if you're not, defined as First Nations under the Indian Act, but you know that you belong to your First Nations culture and you belong to your community, that can be enough where your community can claim you and then explain through a letter on how that claim is actually substantiated. But I think as more, especially organizations and political parties, try to do this race to the finish line over representation of Indigenous voices within their camp, if you're not doing it ethically and responsibly, you are going to have this problem. Perhaps rather than trying to race to the finish line when it comes to identity, we can step back and recognize what self-determination actually looks like. You're going to have First Nations people. We already know there's a former chief that's running for the Conservative Party. We know that historically there's been well-respected Indigenous people. Willie Littlechild, that was a progressive Conservative back in the day. And we've seen people like Jody Wilson-Raybould, another respected Indigenous woman who ran for the Liberal Party. We've seen, powerful Indigenous people also running for the NDP. We see this all the time where these voices end up in different camps. And if there's political parties or organizations that try to be the bigger or the better of all of these voices, you're going to run into these problems. And not only that, it's going to trickle down onto the ground level of, people like me and other people who just want to have a voice, but are expected to think and act and behave and have opinions in a certain way, because at a higher level, that's what we're seeing molded.
Niigaan, in the past week, a lot has happened since Randy Boissonnault was sent to, quoting Edmonton NDP MP Blake Desjardins here, to the Himalayas of the Liberal backbenchers. We still haven't heard from Boissonnault yet. Do you think there are any lingering repercussions over all of that still?
I don't think it's any coincidence that the moment that this scandal emerged, something which drives to the heart of the Liberal Party and is a massive part of their agenda over the past 9 years, their relationships with Indigenous communities, that suddenly they come out with a huge tax announcement of releasing the GST, making big investments in areas across the country. Like, I don't think there's any coincidence around that. I think what they were doing is they probably had an announcement that was probably going to come out in December involving the relaxing of the GST and the HST. GST, and they rushed it. They saw this scandal as being something that could really harm them, because what you saw in the Parliament during question period just a few days before that was Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives getting major points, and not to mention that the real leaders on issues involving Indigenous peoples historically has not been the Conservatives or the Liberals. It's been the NDP. The NDP has at the center of their agenda and really strong Indigenous peoples, Leah Kazan being one of them, and many, many others. Of course, Charlie Angus, just alone, non-Indigenous person, but having a huge support within Indigenous communities. The NDP even was starting to call out the challenges with the Liberals, and they have been historically an ally in the past. The reality was that the Liberals saw a huge scandal right in front of them, and they decided to change the conversation by talking about economy and taxes and Christmas coming up and Christmas buying and all that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, that's just one evidence to show you how sensitive this issue is for the Liberals. And I think that the Liberals will maybe learn from this. I'm hoping. I like to think of the glass half full, in that maybe they've learned that they just can't simply just take anybody at their word. They have to have a process to be able to vet their candidates, because they are one of the two governing parties within the country.
Jen, do you think that Boissonnault's claims of indigeneity were the reason that the Liberals rushed up the GST announcement?
It seems to be that way with the Liberals. Like, I feel like at this point they have to have some sort of like massive announcement on deck for every scandal that seems to happen. And in my mind, I'm envisioning like it's like the bucket of water where we're like, hey, release it because we have another one. And at this point, it's like maybe perhaps they should just account for a scandal at least once a month. And rather than spending tax dollars in the way that they are, they could, come up with some better PR on how to address this, because I don't think this is going to go away. And I think when you have highlighted and, like I said, latched onto Indigenous voices in this way, and not just the party itself, their supporters too. So they're going to have to wear this, unfortunately.
All right, you two will leave it there for the week. I'm sure child welfare might be coming back our way next week as the AFN is set to meet in Ottawa. But appreciate you both being with us.
And I'll be taking a week off. I'm just joking.
Yeah. Let us know ahead of time so that we can plan for that.
I'm just joking. Okay, miigwech.